The first time I opened the stone hatch, I felt cold seawater rush past me, as if the ocean itself was trying to push me back. My team thought it was just another sealed chamber beneath the Mariana Trench, but I knew something was wrong when I saw carvings that didn't match any known culture. That's when I was handed a crumpled sheet of paper with 11 rules written in shaky handwriting. Rules I had to follow if I wanted to leave alive. I remember the first time I broke one, and how the ocean seemed to breathe against the glass around us. I should have left then, but what I saw next made running impossible. The chamber's waterlogged silence pressed against my suit, and I could hear my own pulse louder than the hum of the equipment. When I first read Rule 1, never enter the tomb without the lights on, I thought it was little more than an exaggerated safety measure. After all, we were professionals with decades of training among us, and keeping lights on in the abyss was obvious protocol. Still, the phrasing unsettled me. Why not just say, always keep your gear powered? Why phrase it like a warning rather than a reminder? I tucked the thought away, but it lingered at the back of my mind like a slow current beneath the waves. The deeper we descended, the darker it became, until the glow from our vessel looked like a pale star drowning in black water. I adjusted my helmet lamp, making sure the beam stretched ahead in a clean line. The trench walls on either side rose like jagged cliffs, and it felt as if we were threading a narrow passage into a place the ocean wanted to keep hidden. My colleague Ramirez floated beside me, his breathing sharp over comms as he muttered about the pressure gauges. He had always laughed at superstitions, but the way his words faltered as the darkness thickened told me he wasn't laughing now. We finally reached the carved entrance, a colossal arch etched into the seafloor that didn't belong in any catalog of human history. Symbols wrapped around it in spirals, some resembling stars, others resembling eyes, and the stone looked impossibly preserved despite centuries of crushing weight. The water here felt colder, though the sensors reported no change. I lingered near the threshold, staring into the void beyond the arch, and my light beam seemed to vanish after only a few meters. That was when I remembered the paper in my pocket and how shaky the handwriting had been, as though the writer's hands hadn't been steady enough to finish the list in peace. Inside, the tomb's passageways stretched farther than any sonar reading had suggested. Our lights illuminated portions of statues fused to the walls, figures hunched in kneeling poses, their faces eroded but still somehow watching us. I wanted to think of them as guardians carved by hands long dead, yet the longer I looked, the more I swore their shapes had shifted. Ramirez muttered again, this time asking if I'd noticed how the walls seemed closer now than before. I pretended not to hear, because admitting it out loud made it too real, and every part of me knew we were not supposed to stop moving. The first chamber opened into a wide hall filled with broken stone slabs, like shattered coffins. We shone our beams across the wreckage, and the dust of disturbed sediment curled around us like smoke. Something about the airless silence in that room gnawed at me, as if the ocean outside had been shut out completely, leaving us in a bubble untouched by sound. Ramirez tapped his helmet nervously and asked if my comms were still working. I told him yes, though my voice sounded far away, muffled as if I were speaking through water, even though the signal was clear. His eyes darted nervously, and I knew he was starting to feel it too. I bent down to examine a slab, half buried in silt, its surface covered in spirals that almost glowed under my beam. My fingers brushed across it, and though it should have been cold stone, I swore I felt a faint warmth pulsing beneath. I pulled my hand back instantly, my heart thudding as though I had brushed against living skin. Ramirez cursed under his breath and told me not to touch anything, but he was trembling too, the same curiosity gnawing at him that was tearing me apart. The carvings pulsed again, and I realized the patterns aligned perfectly with the strange script outside the entrance. We moved deeper, passing through another corridor where the statues were closer together, their faces more defined now, their mouths open in silent screams. My lamp flickered once, a sharp blink that made my stomach twist. I tapped the side of my helmet, praying it was only interference from the trench's depth. Ramirez's light remained steady, but his voice cracked as he whispered that we shouldn't linger. He was the skeptic, the one who mocked old divers' tales, yet now he wouldn't even look at me. his gaze locked on the floor as though afraid the statues might notice his eyes. The silence thickened the farther we went. Even the sound of my breathing seemed absorbed by the walls, leaving me feeling weightless and exposed. Then, just as we reached another chamber, my lamp flickered again, this time longer. The beam stuttered across the stone floor, plunging me into shadows that seemed to press closer with every heartbeat. I panicked, fumbling with the switch, terrified of what would happen if the light failed completely. Ramirez grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and hissed through the comms for me to keep it steady. I wanted to tell him it wasn't me, but my throat locked when I realized his beam was dimming too. The chamber around us seemed alive in the half-dark, the statues' eyes gleaming faintly, as if they were catching some hidden light we could not see. Ramirez cursed and switched on his backup torch, flooding the room with harsh brightness. The glow revealed something I hadn't noticed before. A figure crouched against the far wall, smaller than the statues, but shaped almost exactly like us. Its head lifted slightly at the light, revealing a face too smooth, too unfinished, like clay waiting to be molded. Ramirez jerked backward, and his beam swung wildly across the walls, making every carved figure lurch in sudden flashes. We froze, both of us holding our breath, waiting for the figure to move. It didn't. At least not immediately. But when Ramirez muttered a shaky prayer, I thought I saw its chest expand, as though it were breathing in the water just as we were. My own breath quickened, fogging the inside of my visor, as I whispered that we needed to leave. Ramirez didn't argue. He just turned and started back toward the corridor, his movements clumsy, panicked. I followed, my lamp still flickering weakly, and every second without full light felt like a step closer to being swallowed whole. We reached the archway of the first hall when I felt the temperature drop again, this time sharply enough to sting my fingers through the suit. My lamp steadied for a moment, giving me just enough clarity to see the carvings on the walls glowing faintly, not with reflected light, but with something radiating from within. Ramirez shouted my name, but his voice warped through the comms, stretched and low, like it was coming from somewhere else entirely. I spun toward him, only to see his lamp sputter out completely, leaving him swallowed in blackness just beyond my reach. The last thing I saw before my own beam faltered was movement, statues shifting subtly, their heads turning in perfect unison toward the space where Ramirez had vanished. My chest clenched with the realization that the paper hadn't been written by someone superstitious, but by someone who had been here before, and knew exactly what waited in the dark. My hand shook violently as I reached for my backup torch, but before I could switch it on, something brushed against my leg in the water, soft and deliberate. I froze, my lungs burning as if the pressure had tripled in an instant. Then the darkness surged closer, and the light went out completely. When the light died around me, I held still, afraid that the faint touch against my leg might return. In the crushing dark, my breathing was so ragged, I thought it might draw things closer. That was when I remembered Rule 2, never answer a voice that knows your name, and I prayed I wouldn't have to test it so soon. I wanted to believe the warning was just paranoia scribbled on a scrap of paper, but the stillness pressing in around me made every part of me feel like I was already breaking it just by existing here. I fumbled for my backup torch, my gloves clumsy in the water, until I finally managed to click it on. The beam cut a thin path across the chamber, scattering shadows back into the corners where they seemed to gather and wait. Ramirez was gone, his last position swallowed by black, though his tether line still trailed from my belt and stretched into the darkness like a lifeline into nowhere. I pulled it once, gently, but there was no response. The silence that followed was heavier than the trench itself, and in that silence, I heard something whisper. It was faint, like a current curling against the walls, but it was my name. Not distorted, not mechanical, not even filtered through water. It was my name the way my mother used to say it, when I was a child. My heart lurched so violently, I nearly dropped the torch. I gritted my teeth and reminded myself of the rule, the warning that had seemed so absurd when I first read it. Don't answer, don't acknowledge it. Still, the instinct to reply clawed at my throat, because every syllable carried familiarity, the kind of comfort I'd been craving in this abyss. The voice came again, stronger this time, echoing as though it were moving closer down the corridor. I steadied my breathing and kept my torch fixed on the statues lining the passage, refusing to look back. My hands shook so badly that the beam danced, and in those flickers I thought I saw the carved mouths open wider. The tether line tugged suddenly, a sharp jerk that made me stumble forward, and for a moment I nearly called out to Ramirez. But then the voice spoke again, and this time it wasn't my mother's. It was my own voice, low and pleading, telling me to hurry. The chill that gripped me then was worse than the cold of the trench. Hearing myself echo back from the darkness was like being split in two, as if something behind me had peeled my skin away and stolen the sound of my lungs. I wanted to run, but moving too fast down here could mean disaster. Instead, I forced my legs forward, dragging the tether carefully, trying to ignore the way it felt heavier with each step. The statues leaned closer as I passed, their eroded faces twisted into shapes I swore hadn't been there before. Halfway through the corridor, the tether line went slack. My chest tightened as I realized Ramirez must have unclipped it, or worse, it had been severed. I turned my light quickly, searching for the faintest trace of his suit or his lamp, but the darkness swallowed everything whole. Then the voice spoke once more, and this time it was Ramirez's. "I'm here," it said, shaky and urgent. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to reach out, but I clenched my jaw so tightly it hurt. If I answered, I didn't know what would answer back. I moved faster now, the pressure of the water thick against my limbs, every sense screaming that I wasn't alone. The statue's eyes seemed brighter, following me as if lit by something unseen. I whispered to myself that it was just oxygen narcosis, just the mind's way of breaking under the strain. But the reassurance fell flat when the voice came again, this time right beside my helmet. "Why aren't you helping me?" it asked in Ramirez's tone, and I felt the brush of something cold against my shoulder. My scream died in my throat as I surged forward, desperate to get out of the corridor before I broke the silence. The hall ahead opened into another chamber, this one smaller and filled with collapsed stone pillars. I stumbled inside, swinging my torch wildly until its beam steadied on a pile of broken carvings. I leaned against the wall, forcing my breath to slow, though every inhale still felt like I was drowning. Behind me the corridor was quiet again, but I knew it was the same kind of quiet a predator makes before it pounces. My mind replayed the rule, over and over, as if repetition could build a barrier around me. I didn't dare trust the silence. Suddenly my comms crackled alive with static, sharp enough to make me flinch. Then through the distortion, I heard Ramirez's voice clearly. "Stay where you are, I'm coming back." For a heartbeat, hope swelled in me. Maybe he had just gone deeper. Maybe his signal had been lost, and now he was returning. My hand hovered over the comm switch, ready to reply, but the rule screamed at me in my head. I froze, trembling with the knowledge that if I said a single word, whatever was out there would know I'd broken it. My throat ached with the effort of staying silent. The voice spoke again, more impatient now. "Answer me, damn it, I need to know you're alive." The static around the words pulsed like a heartbeat, louder each time, and my torch flickered with the rhythm. I backed slowly into the chamber, my boots disturbing silt that clouded the water in swirls. For the first time since entering the tomb, I felt tears sting my eyes, hot even in the cold depths. I wanted so badly to respond, to not feel so utterly alone, but the memory of those words scrawled in desperate handwriting held me in place. Then came the breaking point. The tether line that had been dragging behind me snapped taut again, yanking hard enough to nearly pull me off my feet. I turned with the torch, and in its circle of light, I saw a silhouette just beyond the doorway, shaped like a diver but standing too still. Its head tilted slightly, and through the comms I heard my name spoken with perfect clarity, no distortion, no hesitation. It wasn't Ramirez anymore. It was me again, my own voice calling from the figure in the dark. I clenched my jaw until my teeth ached, refusing to make a sound. The figure stepped closer, slow and deliberate, its movements almost mocking the way I walked. The tether quivered, as if alive, vibrating with the rhythm of my pulse. I stumbled backward, until my tank struck the wall, nowhere else to go. My torch flickered violently, and in those stutters of light, the figure's face blurred and stretched, cycling through familiar features. My mother Ramirez, myself again, all flickering like a deck of cards being shuffled. The water around it swirled as though stirred by unseen hands, and I knew if the torch went out completely, it would reach me. I braced my shaking hands around the torch, whispering a silent plea to whatever might listen, when the figure froze mid-step. Its head jerked violently, snapping toward the far wall where carvings glowed faintly with their own sick light. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by a silence so complete my ears rang. Then without warning, the figure retreated into the dark corridor, vanishing as if pulled back by invisible threads. The tether line fell slack again, drifting gently in the water, and I collapsed against the pillar behind me, my chest heaving. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread, because as soon as the silence settled, the statues in the chamber began to lean. At first it was subtle, a tilt in the shadows, but then the stone groaned with pressure, and their forms shifted toward me, as though the walls themselves had decided to move. I scrambled to my feet, kicking up silt, desperate to find another way out before the tomb closed around me. My torch beam shook violently, barely piercing the dust, and I realized I might not escape this chamber at all. The statues pressed inward as if the whole chamber was folding around me. Stone shouldn't bend, but here it groaned like something organic, flexing in the shadows. Panic clawed at me until I remembered Rule 3. Never touch what looks alive but doesn't move. The words were carved into the back of my mind, and suddenly every detail of the statues, two lifelike eyes, half-open mouths, their bodies frozen mid-motion, felt less like relics and more like warnings. If they were alive in some way, even the faintest contact might mean an end. I didn't want to imagine. I staggered forward, scanning the edges of the chamber for another passage. My torch cut through the silt, catching glimpses of carvings scattered across the rubble. Most were broken torsos and limbs, their surfaces eroded by time. But now and then, one statue's face was so sharp, so fresh, it might have been chiseled yesterday. I couldn't shake the thought that some of these weren't carved at all. They were caught mid-struggle, sealed in stone by something this trench wanted hidden. My hand brushed dangerously close to one outstretched arm, and I pulled away so fast I nearly lost my balance. The chamber narrowed into a jagged corridor, littered with collapsed fragments. I squeezed through, my gear scraping stone, terrified of brushing against anything that looked too human. The tether line drifted behind me, still slack and useless, and I felt smaller than ever inside this place. My thoughts spiraled back to Ramirez. If he had passed this way, had he broken the rule? Was that why I heard his voice echoing in the dark? The questions hammered at me until I realized silence wasn't my only threat anymore. Something pulsed faintly ahead. At first, I thought it was bioluminescence, some natural glow bleeding from fissures in the rock. But when I steadied my torch, I saw it clearly. A figure sat against the wall, knees tucked to its chest, helmet tilted down. The light was coming from inside its visor, not outside. I froze, every nerve screaming at me. The figure wasn't moving, but the glow inside its helmet flickered like a heartbeat. It looked alive in every sense, yet still as a corpse. The rule burned in my head again, telling me if I touched it, even accidentally, it might wake into something I wouldn't survive. I edged sideways, careful with each step, but the silt betrayed me. A cloud rose and drifted over the figure, and for a moment I thought I saw its chest rise, like a breath pushing against the suit. My hand nearly shot out to steady it, to prove it was nothing more than debris, but I bit down hard and kept my arms tight to my body. I slid past, my torch trembling across the walls, refusing to aim it directly at the visor. Still in my periphery, I swore the head lifted just enough to follow me. Further along, the corridor split. One path narrowed upward into a jagged climb. The other sloped down where water pressure deepened and the light thinned. My training told me to go up, to return to safer depths, but the rule book in my head, the rules I'd been following against every instinct, made me hesitate. The air tasted wrong in my mask, metallic and heavy, as if the trench itself wanted to push me downward. Against reason, I followed the slope, knowing every step pulled me farther into a place no diver should ever be. The walls here pulsed faintly, as if veins of stone carried blood. My torch skimmed over grooves and indentations that formed twisted shapes I couldn't recognize. Then I came upon another figure. This one was kneeling, both hands braced against the floor, its helmet tilted upward. Inside, the visor was cracked, but no face looked back, just emptiness, as if the body had hollowed out and left the suit standing. I crept past it, but this time the temptation was worse. Part of me wanted to knock the helmet, to prove it was truly empty, but the memory of the rule pressed my hands to my sides. I kept moving, though every muscle trembled with restraint. More figures appeared the deeper I went. Some crouched in corners, some lay sprawled across the floor, others leaned against the walls with their helmets turned toward me. None moved, yet each one seemed poised to do so at any second. My light made their visors glisten, and each reflection seemed to twitch, as though an unseen hand had shifted their gaze. I forced myself to breathe steadily, though my lungs screamed with shallow panic. This wasn't a tomb, it was a gallery, and I was walking through the middle of it. Then the tether line tugged again, so sudden I nearly fell forward. I spun with the torch, sweeping it across the corridor, but nothing stirred. Still, the line quivered like it was caught in a current that didn't exist here. I pulled hard, and it went slack again. My heart hammered, but I knew one thing clearly. If Ramirez was still alive, he wasn't leading this line anymore. Whatever had taken it was guiding me. I stopped only when I noticed one figure different from the rest. Unlike the others, it wasn't fully still. Its hand twitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible flex of fingers. I froze, bile rising in my throat. The suit was old, its fabric torn in places, but the movement was unmistakable. I angled my torch carefully, and what I saw made me stumble back. The hand wasn't flexing on its own, it was pressed against the stone wall, and the wall itself was shifting under its touch. The surface rippled, as though it were soft flesh, and the figure's arms sank into it by inches. My instincts betrayed me. I lunged forward, hand outstretched to pull it free, before realizing what I was doing. I stopped inches away, the rule blaring in my skull. If I touched it, if I tried to help, I might join it. My hand trembled in the water, so close that the tips of my gloves brushed the current drifting around its sleeve. The figure's helmet tilted slightly, just enough that I knew whatever was inside, or whatever had once been inside, was aware of me. My arm locked in place, desperate to pull back before I broke the line I'd sworn not to cross. Then, without warning, the figure jerked, not away from the wall, but deeper into it. The stone swallowed its arm past the elbow, then the shoulder, until the torso dragged against the surface and began to sink. I backed away in horror as its helmet tilted skyward, the faint light inside flaring once before vanishing. The wall rippled and sealed behind it, leaving only stone. The tether line trembled violently, as if whatever force had taken the figure was now pulling it too. My body shook, torn between cutting the line and holding on, but I couldn't risk either choice. The chamber around me groaned as the statues shifted again, this time not just leaning but lifting their arms. The motion was slow, grinding, but undeniable. My legs stumbled backward until I pressed against another wall, my torch beam jerking from one unmoving figure to the next. Their hands stretched out as though beckoning me closer, fingers stiff but curling ever so slightly. I clamped my jaw shut, forcing myself not to scream, knowing sound might draw more than stone to life. The water pressed heavier now, as though the trench itself was closing in. Every instinct told me I had lingered too long, that if I didn't find a way out of this gallery, I would become part of it. I forced myself forward, weaving through the rows of still figures, torch shaking wildly as their faces passed inches from my mask. Every moment I expected one to move fully, to grab hold of me, to confirm my worst fear that they weren't statues at all. I reached the far wall and found a narrow opening, barely wide enough to slip through. Relief surged for a heartbeat before dying in my chest. On the other side of the passage, the glow of another helmet waited, perfectly still. Its light pulsed faintly, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a heart that wasn't mine. The glow ahead pulsed like a heartbeat in the visor, and my first thought was to approach, to check if Ramirez had somehow made it this far. But the memory of Rule 4, do not follow the lights that move on their own, gnawed at the edges of my panic. I realized this glow wasn't steady like an emergency lamp or a beacon. It swelled and dimmed in strange rhythms, as though it was aware I was watching. The trench had been silent, suffocatingly still, yet here the water seemed alive with that glow, inviting me to step closer. I forced myself to hold back, pressing against the jagged wall instead of moving forward. The light flickered in a strange pattern, darting slightly to one side and then back again, like a lantern swaying in an unseen current. But I felt no movement in the water around me. My instincts told me it wanted me to give chase, to abandon the thin path of stone that led deeper into the ruin. If I did, I might never find my way back. Worse, I might never even want to return. My breath fogged the visor as I steadied my hands, refusing to drift toward it. The tether line tugged again, subtle but deliberate, and the glow seemed to answer. It drifted a few feet farther into the chamber, illuminating the walls with ghostly blue arcs. Shapes appeared in the light, spirals, claw marks, symbols etched by no hand I recognized. The glow stretched its reach like a spotlight, and I found myself leaning despite every warning in my head. It was beautiful in a way that made my stomach turn, as though my awe was not my own but forced upon me. My fingers twitched on the torch, torn between shutting it off and shining it directly at the glow to reveal its source. Then came the whisper, not in words, not even in sound exactly, but a vibration that hummed through the water and into my skull. It urged me to follow, to step off the path, to walk into the center of the chamber, where the glow pulsed brightest. My knees bent without command, my body threatening to betray me. The rule was the only anchor I had, a mantra in the back of my mind, and I clung to it with every shred of will. If I followed that light, it wouldn't guide me to safety. It would lead me somewhere I was never meant to see. I shifted my gaze, forcing the torch beam away, and stumbled into the side corridor instead. The moment I broke eye contact with the glow, the pressure in my skull lessened, though faint echoes still pulsed behind my ears. My breathing quickened with relief, but I dared not look back. Every step away felt like tearing free from a current, a resistance that pulled harder the farther I moved. My tether line rattled against the wall as if something behind me was testing its strength, checking if I might change my mind and turn around. The corridor narrowed until I had to crawl, pushing my gear through first, dragging myself along the uneven stone. My torch revealed fragments of carvings on the walls, barely legible beneath thick layers of sediment. Some looked like stars, others like eyes, and some like crude outlines of divers kneeling before a larger shape. I couldn't tell if the carvings were warnings, prayers, or a record of what had happened here, but one thing was certain: they weren't meant for human eyes. My chest tightened in the confined space, but turning back toward the light was unthinkable. When the tunnel opened again, the silence was unbearable. I almost wished the glow had followed me, just so I wouldn't feel this crushing emptiness. Instead, the water pressed like lead, muffling every sound, even the rhythm of my own breathing. I swept the torch across the chamber and nearly gasped at what I saw. More helmets, more figures, dozens this time, scattered like a broken congregation. Each one collapsed against the walls or floating slightly above the floor. None glowed, but my stomach churned as I realized their visors were turned toward me. The torch shook in my hand, light bouncing across the ruined chamber. The figures weren't arranged randomly. They formed a rough circle, every visor tilted inward toward the center. And in that center, a single crack split the stone floor, wide enough for the faintest shimmer to seep through. Not bright, not pulsing like the glow before, but a steady shimmer like starlight drowned beneath black water. My throat tightened. That shimmer was a light too, and if it ever started to move, I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to resist. I edged along the perimeter, avoiding the circle, praying my movement didn't disturb the stillness of the suits. One brushed against my arm as I passed, and I flinched so hard I nearly dropped the torch. Nothing happened, but I swore I felt a faint vibration pulse through the fabric, as if something inside the suit still responded to touch. I kept moving, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the ocean. The crack in the center glimmered at the edge of my vision, a subtle lure I dared not acknowledge fully. As I reached the far side, the tether line jerked hard. I spun, torch slashing across the chamber, and my blood ran cold. The shimmer in the crack had grown brighter, pulsing now in the same rhythm as the light I'd turned away from earlier. Worse, the helmets around the circle had begun to tilt upward, slowly, creakingly, until every visor faced me instead of the center. My grip tightened on the tether, but it didn't slacken this time. It pulled again, harder, dragging me toward the shimmering crack. I braced against the wall, refusing to move closer, but my boots slid across the sediment. The shimmer brightened with every tug, its rhythm syncing with my racing pulse until I couldn't tell if it was guiding me, or if my own body had begun to betray me. My vision blurred, the chamber warping as though the water itself bent around the crack. I blinked hard, desperate to clear my sight, and in that instant, I realized the shimmer wasn't a light at all. It was an eye, and it had just opened. The eye beneath the crack widened, its shimmer crawling along the chamber walls, until it felt like the whole ruin was watching me. I clamped down on my breathing, fighting the urge to scream as another memory surged forward. Rule 5. Never answer when they call your name. The rule chilled me because it implied a certainty I hadn't wanted to face. Something here could speak, and worse, it would know exactly who I was. Even as the thought took root, I heard it, faint at first, a bubbling distortion in the water that twisted into something horribly familiar. My own name drifted through the chamber, whispered in Ramirez's voice. The sound froze me in place. My torch beam jerking across the helmets around the circle. Their visors gleamed, reflecting my own mask back at me like 100 fractured mirrors. My name came again, stronger this time, layered with echoes like multiple voices pressing together, all imitating Ramirez, all failing in subtle wrong ways. Each syllable rattled against my skull, as though the trench itself had memorized me. My throat locked, and I realized that the rule wasn't just about resisting the urge to respond aloud. It was about resisting acknowledgement in any form. If I even thought of answering, would that count as acceptance? The tether line jerked again, this time in rhythm with the voice, pulling me closer to the circle. My boots dragged across the silt, and I clawed at the wall for grip, praying the figures wouldn't stir. The whispers sharpened, calling my name with urgency now, desperation dripping from every syllable. They shifted tones, sometimes begging, sometimes commanding, sometimes pleading like a lost child. Each version dug into a different weakness I'd buried deep inside me. They weren't guessing, they knew. The helmets around the circle began to lift higher, tilting as though to follow the sound. Some rose entirely, swaying upright in the water despite their empty suits. My chest burned with the effort to hold steady, to not answer, to not give in. I wanted to scream back, to tell them to stop, to curse Ramirez's stolen voice until it fell silent. But that was the trap. The hunger in their tone wasn't for words. It was for acknowledgement. The moment I gave it, I'd belong to the eye below the crack. I forced myself backward, inch by inch, until my shoulder hit another narrow opening in the wall. It was barely visible, a jagged split that seemed more accident than passage, but I had no choice. The whispers surged louder, calling my name again and again, overlapping in grotesque harmony. My chest heaved as I shoved into the opening, scraping my gear against the stone. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste iron, using the pain as an anchor against the pull of the voices. The passage wound sharply, collapsing inward until I had to crawl on hands and knees. Darkness pressed tight around me, my torch beam swallowed by jagged stone. For a brief moment, the whispers faded, muffled by distance and rock. My lungs sagged with relief, but the silence didn't last. A new sound seeped in, closer, more intimate. My name, spoken directly behind me, as if someone leaned inches from my helmet. The voice was Ramirez again, but softer, almost gentle. My stomach dropped. The narrow passage was too tight for anyone to be here with me, yet I could feel the warmth of breath tickle the back of my neck through the suit. I scrambled forward, desperate to escape the suffocating tunnel. My gloves slipped on the slick stone, fingers clawing for grip. The voice followed, closer now, whispering not just my name, but fragments of memories I hadn't told anyone. Details from childhood, mistakes I thought I'd buried, moments I'd locked away. Each syllable bled into my head until I nearly cracked, the urge to scream my denial overwhelming. But I clenched my jaw, refusing to let the words pass, refusing to give it what it wanted. The tunnel spat me out into another chamber, smaller this time, the walls slick with a black film that pulsed faintly. I collapsed against the floor, gasping, as the whispers faded back into silence. My name lingered on the edges of my thoughts, echoing like a phantom inside my skull. I switched off the torch, plunging the chamber into darkness, praying that if I couldn't see them, they couldn't see me. For a few breaths, it worked. The silence returned, heavy and complete. Then from the far corner of the chamber, a shape unfolded. It looked like another suit at first, slumped against the wall, but as the faint shimmer of bioluminescence rippled across the walls, I saw its helmet tilt toward me, too fast to be mistaken for coincidence. My heart froze. The visor was shattered, the glass fractured into jagged pieces, and behind it was no face, only a hollow void. From that void, the whisper came again, my name stretched into a soundless breath that somehow reached me in the black water. My body pressed against the floor, shaking, knowing that if I even flinched as though I had heard it, I'd be acknowledging it. The figure began to crawl toward me, slow at first, then faster, dragging itself across the chamber with jerking motions. The broken visor caught faint glimmers, each shard reflecting fragments of my own face back at me. My body screamed to run, to shout, to do anything, but the rule chained me still. If I acknowledged it, I was finished. So I lay there, teeth grinding, breath shallow, praying that stillness would keep me safe. The figure stopped inches from my boots, its shattered helmet tilted upward, the darkness inside stretching into a void deeper than the trench itself. The whisper was louder now, so close it felt like it was inside my suit, behind my eyes, inside my lungs. My jaw ached from clenching, and my vision blurred as tears welled against my mask. The thing pressed one gloved hand against my leg, not gripping but resting there, waiting, as though testing how long I could endure. The silence between each whisper was worse than the sound itself, each pause like the inhale of something about to feed. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. And when the next whisper came, sharper, closer, I realized the voice had shifted. It wasn't Ramirez anymore, it was me. My own voice, perfect in tone and cadence, whispering my name as though begging myself to answer. The figure with the broken visor pressed against me until my lungs felt crushed, yet I dared not react, not even to shove it away. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it retreated back into the darkness, leaving only silence behind. My torch flickered to life again, and the chamber swam in dim light. That was when I saw it. a reflection in the visor of my own helmet that didn't belong. My body stiffened, remembering Rule 6, never look directly into the glass when it reflects something else. I forced my eyes away, even as my peripheral vision teased the outline of a figure standing right behind me. The urge to look was unbearable. Every instinct screamed to confirm whether I was alone, but I knew the reflection in my visor was no trick of light. It shifted subtly, like someone breathing down my neck, its presence undeniable. My hands tightened on the tether, knuckles white beneath my gloves, while I angled my torch deliberately away from myself, scanning the floor instead of the glass. If I gave in, if I met those eyes in the reflection, I was certain I would see something wearing my shape, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I staggered toward the far wall, refusing to lift my head, dragging my gaze across the stone as though studying carvings. Strange markings appeared, half hidden beneath algae and silt, spirals that bent into jagged lines, crude figures kneeling beneath enormous shapes that stretched beyond the edges of the walls. My stomach churned as I realized the drawings weren't static. They shifted with the shimmer of the water, as though the story they told was alive, adapting to whoever dared to look. I wanted to study them, but the corner of my vision betrayed me. The reflection followed every step, matching my pace, its outline distorted like something mimicking my body without truly understanding it. The tether line tugged sharply, and my mask clinked against the glass of my visor as I stumbled forward. For the briefest moment, my gaze lifted, and I saw it. Not clearly, not directly, but enough. In the glass was my own face, but the eyes were hollow pits, and the mouth stretched too wide, smiling in a way I never could. I snapped my head down instantly, bile rising in my throat as panic surged through my veins. It wasn't just behind me, it was inside the glass, waiting for the mistake of direct acknowledgement. I pressed my forehead against the stone wall, squeezing my eyes shut, whispering to myself that I was still here, still separate, still alive. The cold seeped through my suit, as if the ruin itself wanted to cradle me, but I pushed away and stumbled deeper into the chamber. My torch beam flickered again, bouncing off surfaces that gleamed faintly with moisture. Every time the light passed near my visor, I forced my gaze elsewhere, terrified the reflection would show me something new. The air in my tank hissed louder, each breath ragged, as though even oxygen didn't want to remain in this place. The chamber narrowed into a crooked passage, one wall slick and glistening like wet skin, the other jagged and sharp. I squeezed through, pressing against the rough stone to avoid the slick side, but the glass of my visor betrayed me again. In its curve I saw movement ahead, a figure stepping smoothly through the tunnel waiting for me. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I fixed my eyes on the jagged stone, scraping my gloves raw just to anchor myself. The figure's outline lingered in the glass, stretched unnaturally tall, its arms dragging along the floor. The tether jerked once more, pulling hard enough that I stumbled into the slick wall. Slime smeared across my visor, and for one horrible instant, I saw the reflection in full. It wasn't tall anymore. It was me, perfectly me, but grinning with that same hollow-eyed smile. My body convulsed in panic, but I tore my head away, refusing to meet its gaze directly. I clawed forward into the passage, until my knees slammed into open floor, the tunnel spitting me into another chamber. I collapsed, breathing hard, refusing to check my reflection, even as the glass felt warm against my skin, as though someone on the other side was pressing their forehead against mine. This chamber was different. No figures, no helmets, no carvings, just smooth walls that curved into a dome, and in the center, a pool of perfectly still water. My torchlight shimmered across its surface, and the sight froze me. Reflections, not of me, not of the chamber, but of places I'd never seen before. Endless corridors of stone, staircases descending into black voids, faces that weren't mine staring upward from impossible angles. The pool was a mirror into somewhere else, and I knew instantly that if I leaned too close, I'd be staring into a world that wanted me. My visor caught the shimmer, and the reflection within twisted into that smiling version of myself again. I backed away, trembling, but the tether line coiled in the water beside me, tugging faintly toward the pool, as though it wanted me to kneel at its edge. My body fought against it, boots skidding across the stone, but the whispers returned, faint and hushed, not calling my name this time, but murmuring indistinct words like a language just beyond comprehension. The surface of the pool rippled, though no current disturbed the chamber. I pressed myself against the wall, hands over my visor, refusing to let the glass betray me again. Yet even through clenched eyes, I felt the weight of the reflection staring back. Then the whispers stopped, replaced by silence so deep it roared in my ears. My lungs heaved, desperate to fill the void, and I dared a glance downward. The pool had stilled completely, its surface flat and perfect, and there, staring back at me, was my own face again. But this time, it wasn't smiling. Its lips moved silently, mouthing words I couldn't hear. I froze, terror locking my limbs, knowing that if I stared even a second longer, I'd be answering a call I didn't understand. The lips in the pool moved without sound, forming shapes I didn't recognize at first. My chest tightened, ready to look away, but then the water itself shifted, rippling outward like a voice trying to escape. The vibration reached through my helmet, and suddenly, the words were clear. It was my name, whispered as if by someone who knew me intimately. Yet I remembered Rule 7, do not answer when they call your name from the water. My throat locked shut even as panic begged me to respond. The pool waited, still, as though expecting me to speak. The sound was softer than the currents I was used to, more like a thread tugging at my eardrums. It didn't shout, it invited. My name repeated again, this time stretched longer, as if the syllables themselves were drowning. The worst part was the tone. It wasn't monstrous. It wasn't strange. It sounded exactly like my mother's voice, the way she used to call me in from playing outside as a child. My heart clenched so hard I thought my chest plate would snap, but I clenched my jaw and kept silent. The tether twitched faintly, brushing against my leg as though encouraging me to step closer. I dragged my body backward until my boots pressed against the wall, never breaking my gaze from the pool's surface. The reflection shifted, no longer my face but hers, as I remembered it years ago. Her hair moved as though underwater, strands twisting into shapes that were almost human, almost familiar. She smiled softly, and my name slipped from her mouth again, echoing louder through the chamber. I wanted to believe it was her, that somehow this place had pulled her image to comfort me, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't a gift, it was bait. My torchlight flickered across the walls, and in that dim light, I noticed something new. The smooth surface of the chamber wasn't plain at all. It was etched, carved with hundreds of names. They spiraled upward, layer after layer, some scrawled crudely as if carved in desperation, others neat and deliberate, etched deeply as though meant to last. My stomach dropped when I realized many were repeated, the same name written again and again in shaky variations. Each one told a story of someone who had answered, someone who had given in. The whispers from the water deepened, growing hungrier, more insistent. The sound rose to a murmur, no longer just my mother's voice. It fractured into a chorus of tones, friends, colleagues, voices I knew, and voices I didn't, all speaking over each other, but always calling the same name. My ears rang with the weight of it, and I clutched my helmet with both hands, squeezing my eyes shut. The urge to reply was overwhelming. If I could just say one word, maybe it would stop, maybe the faces would go away. But the rule rang in my mind like a warning bell. If I answered, I wouldn't be me anymore. The pool rippled violently, splashing against the stone, and droplets hit my visor with a hiss. For the briefest second I saw them, not reflections, but pale hands pressing upward from beneath the surface, clawing at the water's skin, as though begging for release. My breath caught, and I stumbled sideways, nearly tangling myself in the tether. The voices didn't stop. They followed, each one a knife dragging across my thoughts. I staggered toward the exit tunnel, refusing to look back, but the water roared my name one final time, louder than it should have been possible inside stone walls. The passage twisted downward, tight and suffocating, forcing me to crawl at one point, scraping my knees across the jagged floor. Still the echoes carried. I knew they weren't traveling through water or air. They were inside me now, curling around the edges of my thoughts. My fingers trembled as I gripped the stone, dragging myself forward, whispering nonsense into my mask, just to drown them out. But the voices adjusted, whispering in sync with my own words, repeating them back as though mocking me. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't calling anymore. They were answering. I reached a wider chamber, panting, sweat pooling inside my suit. This space felt wrong immediately. The ceiling hung lower, heavy with roots that pulsed faintly, as though veins carried something through them. At the center was another pool, smaller but deeper, the water blacker than any shadow I had seen. I tried not to look, tried to skirt the edges, but the tether jerked suddenly and dipped into the pool. The voices hushed instantly, replaced by silence, so thick it felt like the world had been muted. My name slipped free of my throat, unbidden, whispered by instinct, but no sound came out. Then the pool breathed. The surface rose like a chest inhaling, and bubbles escaped upward in slow bursts. The tether coiled around my leg, pulling taut, dragging me toward the water. I dug my boots into the ground, hands clawing at the stone, but the strength of it was unrelenting. The silence grew unbearable, pressing into my skull until it rang louder than any scream. When the water finally spoke again, it wasn't my name, it called. It was a word I didn't understand, something ancient, something that felt wrong in my mouth, even as I almost repeated it. I clamped my teeth shut, fighting against the compulsion, but my lips trembled, forming the shapes without meaning to. My reflection appeared again, staring up from the pool. This time, it wasn't smiling. It was wide-eyed, frantic, mouthing words too fast for me to follow, as though trying to warn me. The pool's tether pulled harder, dragging me to my knees, the black surface inches from my visor. The reflection screamed silently, begging me not to do what my mouth already wanted. My lungs screamed for air as panic crushed me, and the silence broke. My name rang out once more, but this time it came from directly behind me. When I heard my name called from behind, every nerve in my body screamed to turn and see who or what stood there. But I remembered Rule 8, never look over your shoulder in the lower tunnels. My breath rasped against my visor, shallow and ragged, as the sound crawled closer, echoing through the stone like bare feet dragging along wet ground. My muscles locked, frozen between instinct and terror, as the tether still pulled at me from the pool. Whatever had spoken was waiting, right at my back, and every fiber of me knew that one glance would mean I would never leave this place. The voice shifted, as if testing my patience, stretching into different tones, trying out the familiar like a cruel game. My father's voice joined the chorus, then my sister's, each one murmuring my name with just enough warmth to stir something painful in me. I clenched my jaw until it ached, pressing my helmet against the cold stone of the tunnel to stop myself from turning. The sound of breath was close now, so close I swore I felt condensation forming along the back of my suit. I prayed silently that whatever it was would pass me by. The tunnel seemed endless, every second dragging out into eternity as the voices scraped along the walls. My hands searched blindly for purchase, pushing me inch by inch away from the pool. The stone under my fingers was slick, but I forced my body forward, never daring to let my head turn. My shoulders twitched violently with the effort, and I thought of the names carved into the chamber walls. How many of them had given in simply because they couldn't resist one look? The idea clung to me like mold, wrapping around my mind and whispering that I was next. A vibration rumbled faintly through the stone, subtle at first, then growing into a steady rhythm. At first I thought it was my pulse hammering in my skull, but no, the floor itself was trembling. Something was moving in sync with me, step for step, just out of sight. I bit down hard, gritting my teeth as my vision blurred with sweat. The urge to look was unbearable, gnawing at the back of my skull like teeth. My imagination filled in the gaps with horrors I didn't want to name, each worse than the last, and still I crawled forward. The tether jerked sharply, and I nearly screamed. I thought it was the pool pulling me back, but no, the pressure was coming from behind. Something was holding the line now, tugging gently as if playing with me, testing my resolve. I dug my fingers into the stone until they burned, straining against the pull with every ounce of strength. The footsteps grew louder, dragging, wet, patient. I told myself over and over that I wouldn't look, that 1 second of weakness would end me, but my body betrayed me, trembling violently as my neck muscles spasmed under the weight of temptation. The air in the tunnel grew thick, humid, pressing into my lungs with every shallow breath. My visor fogged, and in the blur of condensation, I swore I could make out shapes shifting at the edges of my vision. Not clear, not distinct, just pale movement where no light should reach. My heart pounded as I squeezed my eyes shut, relying only on touch to guide me. The tunnel floor shifted downward, and I slid forward, tumbling onto my hands and knees. The sound of breathing was still at my back, heavier now, and I knew it wasn't going to let me go so easily. I reached a fork in the tunnel, 2 narrow passages yawning open like jaws in the dim glow of my light. My brain screamed at me to choose quickly, to move, to escape the presence that loomed so close. The tether dragged lightly across the stone, guided toward the left passage, but I resisted, uncertain if the pull was mine or something else's. The breathing quickened, a rush of air damp against the nape of my neck. I lunged blindly to the right, scraping my shoulder against the jagged wall, and forced myself deeper into the unknown passage. The new tunnel twisted sharply, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost it. The silence that followed was crushing, pressing into me like the water above. Relief threatened to undo me, but deep down, I knew better. Things down here didn't stop, they waited. My hand brushed something carved into the stone. Lines, symbols, more names. Some were scratched out violently, gouged so deep the rock had split around them. My light flickered, and in that brief stutter of darkness, I thought I saw fresh scratches forming, as though someone unseen was etching new warnings right before my eyes. I pressed forward, my body screaming for rest, when the sound returned, breathing impossibly close, as though it had never left. My heart sank. It had followed me through the fork, no slower, no faster, just patient. The tether slid along behind me, brushing my boots, and the footsteps quickened slightly, just enough to keep pace with my fear. My chest seized as I realized what it wanted. It didn't need to catch me, it only needed me to break. The thought was unbearable, a trap in itself, and my hands shook so badly, I almost dropped the torch. At the end of the tunnel, I found a doorway carved into the stone. It wasn't like the others. This one was rectangular, perfectly formed, framed by intricate etchings of eyes that seemed to follow me as I approached. My instincts screamed not to step through, but the breathing behind me left no choice. I staggered forward, clutching the tether, and ducked inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the sound stopped completely. Silence fell, thick and unnatural, and the air pressed down like a weight. I thought I had escaped, until I realized the room ahead was lined with mirrors, each one reflecting my back. The mirrors reflected my back, dozens of me frozen mid-step. But something was wrong. My movements lagged, a half-second slower in the glass than in my body. A cold wave of dread rippled through me as I remembered Rule 9. Break any mirror you see before it shows you something else. My torchlight trembled across their surfaces, and I swore some of the reflections weren't moving at all. They stared rigidly outward, their faces pale, their mouths half open, as if caught mid-scream. I gripped the tether like a lifeline, forcing myself not to meet their gazes directly. The silence in the chamber was oppressive, but my heartbeat thundered so loudly it almost masked the faint scraping sound behind the glass. My reflections shifted out of sync, one tilting its head when I hadn't moved, another raising a hand slowly toward me. Panic surged, but I clenched my teeth and swung the torch down. The glass cracked with a sharp fracture that rang through the chamber like breaking bone. The reflection split, and for a moment, I thought I had freed myself, until liquid seeped from the crack, black and thick, crawling down the surface as though alive. I staggered back, my heel scraping across the stone, and the reflections around me began to ripple. One by one, the others started imitating the broken one, twitching unnaturally, their mouths widening far too large for their faces. The silence broke with a low hum, vibrating through the glass until it set my teeth on edge. My hand trembled, but I swung the torch again, smashing another mirror into fragments. The shards scattered across the floor, but even broken, each piece still held a piece of me, blinking and twitching out of rhythm. It felt like being watched by hundreds of fractured eyes. I forced myself to focus, smashing mirror after mirror, my breath ragged, the sound of shattering filling the chamber. Every break released that same black liquid, pooling on the floor and thickening the air with a foul stench of salt and decay. It clung to my boots, sticky and warm, slowing me as I moved. The reflections grew stranger, less like me, and more like something wearing my shape. Their smiles were crooked, their movements jerky, and when I raised the torch again, I realized some weren't raising theirs at all. They stood still, waiting, watching. The tether tugged faintly, a reminder that something outside still had hold of me. Yet here in this chamber, it felt like the reflections themselves were pulling me deeper. I smashed another mirror, shards cutting across my gloves, and hissed through my teeth. This time, the reflection didn't shatter. It laughed, soundless, its chest heaving in jerks of mockery. My stomach turned to ice. It was no longer an echo of me. It was something else. My hand shook violently as I raised the torch again, ready to strike harder, but before I could, the tether jerked sharply toward the unbroken reflection. The pull dragged me forward, my knees scraping against the stone floor as I struggled against it. The mirror swelled unnaturally, its surface bulging outward like a membrane ready to burst. My reflection pressed its hands against the glass from the inside, its eyes wide, frantic, pleading with me not to strike. Confusion knifed through me, freezing my arm mid-swing. If it wasn't me, why did it look so desperate, so terrified? The black liquid bubbled up around my boots, reaching my shins now, and I knew hesitation would drown me here. I closed my eyes, swung hard, and the glass erupted outward. The shards exploded across the room, embedding in the stone walls, slicing across my suit. For a moment, silence returned. I gasped, stumbling back as the tether loosened, relief flooding through me. Then I heard it, the sound of glass reforming, shards skittering across the floor, as if pulled by invisible hands. The mirrors reassembled themselves slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. My relief curdled into horror as I saw what they were forming. Not my reflection this time, not me. The glass held faces I didn't recognize, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes and mouths stretched impossibly wide, and they were moving closer. I staggered toward the exit at the far end of the chamber, my boots sticking to the thickening pool of black liquid. The mirrors groaned as the faces inside pressed harder against their barriers, the glass bending outward, threatening to spill them into my world. My breath caught as one cracked open, a hand bursting through, pale fingers dripping with brine. I sprinted, swinging the torch wildly at the reaching limbs, smashing every mirror in my path. The sound was deafening now, a chorus of shattering and rebuilding, over and over, until I could barely tell if the chamber was breaking apart or sealing itself tighter. The exit tunnel narrowed, but I shoved myself through, scraping against the walls, desperate to escape the reflections. Behind me, I heard the final shatter, louder than all the rest, followed by silence that felt final, absolute. My lungs heaved, my body trembling, until I realized the black liquid was still on my boots. It hadn't stayed in the chamber. It dripped steadily onto the floor, leaving a trail behind me. My heart froze as I realized the mirrors didn't need to hold me anymore. They could follow. Ahead, the tunnel bent sharply downward, into a darkness where even my torchlight couldn't reach. The black trail from my boots glistened in the dim torchlight, a reminder that the chamber hadn't let me leave untouched. As I pressed deeper into the tunnel, the air grew denser, almost metallic, carrying the weight of pressure from miles above. Then it started, 3 sharp pulses reverberating through the stone around me, measured and deliberate. My chest tightened as I remembered Rule 10. If you hear knocking in the stone, knock back only once. The sound wasn't random. It was searching, waiting for a reply, and every instinct screamed at me not to move at all. The knocks came again, closer this time, as though the walls themselves were hollow and something crawled inside. My fingers twitched against the tether, tempted to test the rule, to see what would happen if I didn't answer at all. But the silence after the sound was worse than the noise itself. Thick, stretching, accusatory. I forced myself forward, each step echoing like a betrayal, wondering if those steps were being counted against me. My torchlight wavered across the tunnel, illuminating veins of quartz that shimmered faintly, as if reflecting something moving behind them. Then, without warning, the knocking shifted. Instead of 3, it was 4, a sequence that didn't belong, repeated with purpose, louder each time. My pulse spiked, and I pressed my helmet against the stone, listening as vibrations rattled through my bones. It felt like a code, one I didn't know how to read, but I understood the urgency behind it. My gloved fist lifted almost involuntarily, but I froze, the rule weighing heavy in my mind. 1 knock, no more. Anything else was a risk I couldn't afford. I drew in a shaking breath and struck the stone once. The response was immediate. The walls hummed, vibrating with a low, resonant groan that traveled deep into the earth. The liquid on my boots quivered as though alive, rippling with the same rhythm. A new sound joined in, the faint scrape of nails against stone, dragging slowly in circles all around me. I knew then that my knock had been heard, but not by one thing, by many. The tunnel narrowed suddenly, forcing me to crouch, and the vibrations intensified until my teeth rattled. Whatever lived behind the walls was moving closer, gathering, listening to every heartbeat I made. I pressed forward, sweat dripping down my face, fogging the visor as I crawled. The knocks returned again, 3 this time, then 5, then 6, growing frenzied, impatient. My throat burned with the effort of staying silent, of not responding. A handprint appeared on the wall beside me, pressed from the inside, its fingers long and crooked, pushing against the stone as though testing for weakness. I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood, forcing myself onward, never daring to lift my hand again. The rule had saved me once, but I sensed testing it twice would be suicide. The tunnel opened suddenly into a cavern, its ceiling high and dripping with condensation. Pools of black liquid dotted the floor, connected by streams that pulsed faintly like veins. I moved carefully, stepping between them, when the knocks started again, this time from the ground beneath me. My boots vibrated with each pulse, steady and slow, as though something massive shifted far below. The tether tightened in warning, but the stone directly under my feet bulged upward, faintly, a ripple traveling outward across the cavern. The pools quivered in response, their surfaces breaking as if stirred from within. I stumbled toward the far wall, but another knock thundered through the cavern, so loud it nearly dropped me to my knees. The pools erupted with bubbles, and faint silhouettes twisted beneath their surfaces. My torch flickered violently, light scattering across the cavern, until everything seemed to move at once. The knocking continued, rapid and chaotic, and I realized with dawning horror that they weren't just asking anymore, they were demanding. My fist clenched at my side, every nerve screaming to answer, to appease whatever was calling, but I forced my hand still, teeth grinding as the stone bulged again. A crack tore across the cavern floor, splitting one of the pools wide open. Black liquid surged upward, spraying against the ceiling, before crashing back down in heavy sheets. I ducked beneath the rain, shielding my visor, and in the chaos, I saw them, faces pressing up from the liquid, mouths opening and closing in rhythm with the knocks. The sound was deafening now, shaking loose stones from the walls. I ran, boots slipping across the slick floor, every step punctuated by another pounding blow from the stone below. I knew if I faltered, the ground would open and take me whole. At the far end, I spotted a narrow fissure, barely wide enough to squeeze through. I lunged for it, scraping my shoulders as I shoved myself inside, the knocking booming just behind me. The fissure sloped downward, tight and suffocating, but it carried me away from the cavern. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, my body trembling uncontrollably, until the knocks faded into silence once more. Relief washed over me in waves, but I didn't trust it. The silence down here was never empty. It always meant something was listening, waiting. My torch illuminated the path ahead, where the stone shimmered faintly as though wet. I pushed forward, trying to steady my breathing, when a new sound emerged. Not knocking, tapping, light, rapid, as if fingertips brushed just inches from my ear. My blood turned to ice as I realized it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside my helmet. My hand shot up to rip the visor away, but I froze, every instinct screaming at me not to break the seal. The tapping grew faster, impatient, until a single knock boomed from deep within the stone ahead, echoing down the tunnel. My fist lifted before I could stop it, and this time, I wasn't sure I'd be able to strike only once. The tapping inside my helmet had left my nerves raw, my heartbeat thrumming in my throat. Every step into the narrowing fissure felt heavier, as though the stone was trying to hold me back. My torchlight flickered across the walls, catching glimmers like trapped reflections. That's when I remembered Rule 11. Never look directly at the glass when it moves. My visor was glass. My gauges were glass. Even the faint puddles in the rock were mirrors in their own way. I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, knowing curiosity could be the last mistake I made down here. The fissure leveled out into a chamber, not wide but high, its ceiling lost in shadow. My light swept across broken equipment, helmets, tools, shattered masks, all half buried in the sediment. Some still carried names, etched into the metal, scratched out as though whoever left them had wanted to erase themselves before disappearing. My reflection wavered in one intact visor, distorted by a hairline crack. For a heartbeat, it moved differently than I did. My lungs froze, and I tore my gaze away, clamping down on the instinct to look again. The rule wasn't a suggestion. It was a barrier between life and death. The chamber air was colder, pressing against me like ice water. My breath fogged the inside of my helmet, and the mist on the visor shifted strangely, sliding sideways as if stirred by fingers I couldn't see. I clenched my jaw and pressed on, refusing to wipe it away. Every nerve screamed that I wasn't alone. The tether tugged at me faintly, but when I glanced back, it was slack, dragging limply into the darkness. Something had severed the tension, but not the line itself. I swallowed hard and kept moving, knowing that stopping would only invite the glass to shift again. The tunnel beyond sloped upward, slick with condensation that trickled down the stone in rivulets. As I climbed, I passed old lanterns bolted to the walls, their cracked glass fogged with black mold. I dared not linger on them, even when my peripheral vision caught shapes sliding across the inside of the panes. At the edge of my sight, it looked like faces pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams. I blinked and forced myself onward, each step heavier than the last. The slope narrowed until I had to crawl, my torch scraping against the walls, throwing jittering shadows forward. When the passage opened again, I found myself in a cathedral-like chamber. Stalactites dripped from above like teeth, and pools of water mirrored the ceiling, so perfectly it was impossible to tell which way was up. My torch quivered as I scanned the chamber, trying not to meet my own reflection in the liquid. The surface rippled once, then twice, though no drop had fallen to disturb it. A reflection leaned closer than it should have, peering up at me from the pool with a tilt of its head. I clenched my eyes shut, trembling, then stepped carefully along the jagged rocks to avoid looking again. The further I went, the louder the glass-like sounds became. It wasn't just knocking anymore, but scraping, like fingernails dragged across a mirror. My visor fogged again, this time with distinct handprints that bloomed across the inside. My breath came ragged, but I kept my eyes fixed forward, resisting the temptation to check if the handprints moved when I did. The chamber narrowed into a spiraling shaft that wound upward, and I climbed, desperate to leave the mirrored pools behind. But with every step, I felt more eyes on me, watching from the glass that lined my own skin. Halfway up, my torchlight flared and died. Darkness swallowed everything. I froze, gripping the rock with shaking hands. Then faintly, I saw it, my reflection glowing dimly in the glass faceplate. Even though there was no light left to create it, it tilted its head, slower this time, deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out every other sound. Something whispered against the glass, not in words but in vibrations that rattled my teeth. I climbed blindly, refusing to look, each movement driven more by terror than determination. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they became almost intelligible. At last, a faint glow appeared above, the suggestion of an exit. I hauled myself upward, nails cracking inside my gloves, lungs burning with every breath. The glow sharpened into the outline of a hatch, rusted but intact, built into the ceiling. Relief surged through me, wild and desperate. I reached for it, fumbling for the latch, when the glass in my visor flexed outward with a slow, deliberate ripple. My reflection smiled at me from the inside, a fraction too late, its lips curling wider than humanly possible. I nearly let go, nearly fell back into the abyss, but forced the hatch open with a final scream of effort. I pulled myself through and collapsed onto cold metal grating. My torch flickered back to life, revealing I was no longer in stone, but inside a chamber of rusted steel, walls lined with viewing windows. Each pane of glass looked out into the abyss, but what pressed against them wasn't ocean. Faces smeared across the glass, their features stretching unnaturally, watching me from the other side. Their eyes followed as I staggered to my feet, their mouths moving in perfect unison. My hands shook violently, fumbling for the tether, but it dangled limp and severed. I was cut off, alone, the last thread gone. The faces leaned closer, glass groaning with the pressure of their weight. My visor fogged again, and when I dared a glance, dozens of handprints bloomed across it, each one pressing harder until the surface creaked. I stumbled backward into the center of the chamber, surrounded by glass on all sides, every pane bulging inward, as though the barrier between us was seconds from breaking. My torch flickered, threatening to die once more, shadows rippling across the faces as their smiles widened in perfect synchronization. I clenched my fists, heart hammering, and remembered the last rule in its entirety. Never look directly at the glass when it moves. The windows all around me shivered, their surfaces rippling like liquid, and my reflection in the visor began moving on its own again, lifting its hand slowly toward me. I shut my eyes, and in the suffocating dark, I felt the glass finally give way.